I want to be clear about something before I begin. I have worked the medical wards of Varath 9 for 11 years. 11 years of overnight shifts, of watching species from 47 different star systems come through those sliding doors with injuries that should have killed them, with diseases that had no name in any catalog I'd been trained on, with biology so complicated it made my head swim on the best days. I have seen things in this ward that I will never be able to explain. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened in Bay 7 during the third cycle of year 4471. My name is Dr. Ivith Carroll. I am Varathari. We are a long-lived species, slim and pale, with 4 fingers on each hand and eyes that see in a wider spectrum than most. We are considered among the galaxy's more capable physicians, and I say that not out of pride but out of context, because I want you to understand that I am not easily rattled. I have been doing this long enough that very little surprises me anymore. Or so I thought. It started with the nurses. More specifically, it started with me noticing that nurses kept going into Bay 7 when they had absolutely no clinical reason to be there. Bay 7 was occupied by a human. Species designation, Homo sapiens subclassification, military personnel branch, Terran Coalition Forward Medical Corps. Name recorded in our intake logs as Corporal Davin Rook, age 29 in human years, which translates to somewhere in the early physical prime of their rather short lifespan. He'd come to us 11 days prior with what should have been a routine admission, blunt trauma to the left side of his torso from a debris impact during a routine maintenance walkthrough aboard the Terran Coalition vessel Harrowfield. Standard contusion, possible microfracture of something they call a rib. I had reviewed his intake file and handed him off to the ward team with instructions to monitor and keep him comfortable. For a species as fragile as humans, we take no chances. 11 days he'd been there. And somewhere around day 4, I started noticing it. It began the way these things always do, so quietly you almost mistake it for nothing. I was walking Corridor 7 on my end-of-shift rounds, datapad in hand, reviewing overnight notes, when I glanced through the observation window of Bay 7 and saw 2 of my nurses inside. Not 1. 2. Standing on either side of the bed, both apparently occupied with some kind of task. One was refilling his water canister. The other was adjusting the environmental temperature controls that we install in human occupancy bays to keep the humidity at the narrow range their skin requires. It wasn't unusual on its own. Humans require more hands-on attention than most species because their biology is so dependent on external conditions. Temperature too low, they shiver and their circulation suffers. Too dry, their skin cracks and becomes susceptible to infection. They are in many ways like keeping a very specific kind of plant alive. The ward staff all know this. We adjust. But the thing that made me slow my walk and actually look, really look, was that neither nurse appeared to be in any hurry to leave. They were talking to him. Not clinical communication, not the standard confirmation of comfort scripts we run through with patients from species whose language we don't fully speak. They were engaged, leaning slightly forward. One of them, Nurse Orvath, a young Vexeni female with iridescent scales down her neck, actually laughed at something he said. A real laugh, not a polite one. I stood there for a moment, watching through the glass, and then continued on my way. I told myself it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. Section 2, the count begins. Day 5. I arrived for my shift at the standard time, came through the main corridor with my morning summary already loaded onto my pad. I was going over the overnight anomalies, nothing dramatic. A Vreth patient in Bay 12 with unexplained fever spikes. A Yanosi elder in Bay 3 who had refused to eat anything we offered, when I passed Bay 7. 3 nurses. 3. Orvath was still in there. She had no reason to be. Her assigned bays that morning were 9, 10, and 11. Bay 7 wasn't hers. And yet there she was, along with 2 others I recognized from the night rotation who should have been collecting their things and heading home. They weren't heading home. They were all standing around Corporal Rook's bed in a rough semicircle, and he was talking. Hands moving, humans do that. I've observed it. They use their hands when they talk even when they don't need to, and the 3 of them were watching him with an expression I can only describe as intent. I stopped walking. I watched for a full 30 seconds. Then I pushed the intercom button on the bay panel. Is there a clinical reason for 3 staff members to be in Bay 7 simultaneously? All 3 of them startled. Orvath turned toward the intercom panel with a slightly guilty expression. The human, Corporal Rook, looked at the camera above the door and gave it a small, contained smile. Not a smug smile. More like the smile of someone who was fully aware of the situation and found it gently amusing. Orvath cleared her throat and said, "We were performing a comfort assessment." "A comfort assessment?" "Yes, doctor. For a stable patient with a healing microfracture." "Yes, doctor. One of you can complete a comfort assessment. The others have their own bays. Please return to your assignments." They dispersed. I watched them go, each one looking just slightly deflated in a way that was difficult to name. Rook's smile had faded, replaced by an expression I couldn't read. He glanced toward the window directly at me, though I don't think he could see me through the observation glass, and then looked back at the ceiling. I made a note on my pad. Observation, Bay 7 patient drawing disproportionate nursing attention. Monitor. Day 6. I counted. Not obsessively. I had a full ward to manage, 2 critical care patients in the intensive bay, a drug interaction in Bay 14 that was consuming half my attention. But I kept a tally in the back of my mind, the way I keep track of 100 other small irregularities at any given time. By midday, 6 different nurses had been in Bay 7. 6, for a stable, non-critical patient. The average for that patient category on a normal day is 2 visits, 1 morning check, 1 evening. 6. I asked my head nurse, Tavris, a Verathari male with 20 years on the ward, unflappable, precise, the kind of colleague you want standing next to you during a crisis, whether there was something in the care plan I'd missed, something that required additional monitoring. He checked the file on his pad. "No," he said, frowning slightly. "Standard recovery protocol. He's ahead of projections, actually. His tissue is healing faster than the model predicted." "Then why is half the ward staff rotating through his bay?" Tavris paused. He pulled up the entry log. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at me with an expression that I had never, in 20 years of working with him, seen on his face before. It was embarrassment. "I'm not certain," he said, which meant he knew exactly and wasn't willing to say. I filed that away. Section 3, the machine room and the question of sound. On day 7, something happened that shifted my focus from curious to genuinely puzzled. Bay 7 sits at the end of Corridor 7, which is, as the name suggests, the 7th subcorridor off the main artery of the ward. It's a quieter part of the facility. The bays at the end of the corridor are used for long recovery patients who benefit from lower ambient noise. The environmental controls there are set to a soft hum, the kind of near silence that promotes cellular regeneration in most biological species. I was in the machine room adjacent to Bay 7, a small utility space where we store the nutrient dispensers and environmental calibration equipment, running a calibration check on the humidity systems for the human occupancy bays. It's a job that normally takes 12 minutes. I do it personally because our Verathari engineers tend to calibrate for Verathari biology as default, and the adjustments for human patients are specific enough that I prefer to oversee them. So I was in that machine room, behind a wall panel, running the calibration sequence. And I could hear him. Not clearly, the walls on this station are dense, designed to contain sound for patient privacy, but enough to catch the rhythm of it if not the words. He was talking, not on a communication device, not reading aloud, which some patients do when they're bored, talking to someone in the room. I finished the calibration, stepped out of the machine room, and looked through the observation window of Bay 7. There were 2 nurses in there. Neither of them was on Bay 7's assigned care team. One of them, Specialist Myron, a Thalori with gray-feathered crest markings and a reputation for meticulous paperwork, was sitting in the chair beside the bed. Sitting, not performing a task, just sitting, arms folded, listening. The other was leaning against the wall near the window with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted. And Corporal Rook was talking, not quickly, not urgently, slowly, pausing between sentences, the way you talk when you're telling a story that matters. I watched for a moment longer than I should have. Then I knocked on the bay door and stepped in. Both nurses came to attention. Rook's eyes went to me and he stopped mid-sentence. "Specialist Myron," I said, Your bays are 8 and 9 today, correct? Yes, doctor. And bay 7 is not among them. No, doctor. I looked at the other nurse, Keed, a Vexeni male, younger, who had the distinct look of someone who'd been caught somewhere he shouldn't be. Same question. Yes, doctor, I understand. Then I'd appreciate it if both of you returned to your assignments. They left, I stayed, because now I was in the room and it would be strange to immediately leave after having entered, and also because I was, I'll admit it, curious. I looked at the human. He looked back at me. He had the kind of face that takes a moment to read, not because it was expressionless, it was quite expressive, but because the expression cycled through quickly and settled on something neutral before you could fully catch what had been there first. Wide-set eyes, brown, with that particular human quality of seeming to focus slightly more narrowly than is comfortable, as if concentration itself is a physical thing he's pressing against you. Dark hair, cut short in the way military humans prefer. A jaw that was set but not rigid, someone who was used to waiting. Corporal Rook, I said because I had to start somewhere. How is your pain level today? 3, he said, on your scale or mine? On ours. Which puts you at? Somewhere between your scales 2 and 4, depending on whether I'm moving. He paused. I'm fine, doctor, genuinely. I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I didn't assume you were. He seemed to consider whether that was true. Then he nodded slightly, accepting it. Can I ask, I said, keeping my voice completely professional, completely clinical, whether there's a reason the nursing staff seems to find this particular bay unusually compelling? Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not quite amusement either. Something in between, worn lightly, like a jacket he'd put on so many times it had shaped itself to his shoulders. I'm pretty sure that's a question for your nursing staff, he said. I'm asking you. A pause. Then I talked to them. I waited. That's it, he said. I just talked to them. Patients don't usually do that, I've been told. Most of them, your other patients, don't communicate much with the staff beyond what's required. So when someone actually talks to them, he stopped, tilted his head. They come back. I stood there for a moment, processing this. What do you talk about? I asked. He looked at me for a beat. Them, he said simply. I ask about them. Part 2, the texture of a habit. Section 4, what Orvath told me. I went to nurse Orvath the next morning, day 8, before the shift started. I found her in the supply prep room, laying out the morning medication trays with the careful, methodical focus she always brought to the task. Orvath was young, barely 3 years out of the medical academy, but she was good, detail-oriented, the kind of nurse who remembers what every patient had for their previous meal and cross-references it with their dietary requirements without being asked. I sat on the edge of the work counter and waited until she looked up. Dr. Carroll, she said, going still in that particular way junior staff go still when they realize the senior physician has come to have a conversation rather than pass through. Relax, I said. You're not in trouble, I want to understand something. She relaxed slightly, continued with the trays. Bay 7, I said, tell me about it. She was quiet for a moment. Her iridescent scales caught the morning light, shifting from pale gold to something closer to bronze as she turned slightly toward me. I know we're not assigned there, she said. I know you've noticed. I have. It's hard to explain. Try. She put down the tray she was holding and looked at me directly, more directly than most junior staff would manage in this kind of conversation. One of the things I liked about Orvath was that she didn't flinch from eye contact when she believed she had nothing to be ashamed of. On my 3rd day with him, she said, I went in to do his morning check. He was awake already. Humans wake early, I've noticed, even when there's nothing to wake up for. And I asked him the standard questions. Pain level, sleep quality, appetite. And he answered all of them, and then he asked me one. What question? She paused. He asked me how my morning was. I waited for more. That was it, she said. Just how was my morning, like it was a normal thing to ask, like he was actually curious about the answer. She shook her head slightly. I didn't know what to do with it. I've been working this ward for 3 years and no patient has ever asked me that. I didn't even know how to answer at first. I said adequate because that's what you say, that's the kind of thing you say when you're on shift and someone asks, but he sort of looked at me and said, just adequate. That sounds like it might be understating it a bit. She smiled at the memory. A small, private smile. The kind that surfaces when you're telling someone about a moment that landed differently than you expected. And I told him, she said. I told him that Specialist Tavern had given me a difficult assignment review the week before and I was still not quite over it. And he listened. He actually listened. He asked a question in the middle not to redirect the conversation, just to understand better. And at the end he said, she paused again, seeming to search for the exact phrasing. He said, "That sounds genuinely hard. I'm sorry that happened." Not, "I'm sure it'll work out." Not, "These things happen." Just that it sounded hard and he was sorry. She picked up the tray again. "I know it sounds like nothing," she said. "I know it sounds like he just talked to me, but none of our patients do that, doctor. I don't mean they're rude, they're not. The Vreth patients are polite. The Yanosi are formal and correct. The Thalori sometimes bring small gifts, but none of them just ask how you're doing and mean it." I sat with that for a moment. "And then you told the others," I said. A slight pause. "I didn't exactly tell them, I just mentioned to Keed that the human in Bay 7 was different in terms of how he talks to people, and Keed was curious." She gave me a sideways glance. "We're a social species, Dr. Vexeni, I mean. We're built around exchange, and this ward is," she stopped. "Go on." "It's clinical," she said carefully. "Which it should be, I understand that. But sometimes it's very clinical. And he's just not." She looked at the tray. "He said something on day 5 when 3 of us were in there. You came on the intercom and sent us back to our bays, and after we left, I heard from Keed, who stayed an extra minute after we left," Rook said. "I'm sorry if I got you in trouble." Not defensively, just sorry. Like it mattered to him that he might have caused a problem for us. She looked up. "When is the last time a patient said sorry to you for something that wasn't even their fault?" I had no answer for that. Section 5, the night I stayed late. Day 9. I should not have been in the ward at 2200 hours. My shift ended at 1900. I had stayed for 2 hours completing documentation. The Vreth patient in Bay 12 was stable, but needed careful notation for the specialist review scheduled for the morning. And by the time I finished, I should have walked straight to the transit bay and gone home. Instead, I found myself walking corridor 7. I told myself it was routine rounds, that I was passing through because it was on my way, and it made sense to visually confirm that all bays were quiet before I left. I was telling myself a polite version of what was actually happening, which was that I had been thinking about what Orvath said for most of the day, and I wanted to see for myself, without the authority structure of a shift in progress, what this human was like at the quiet end of the day. The ward at night is different. The main lights dim to approximately 40%, which suits most species' sleep biology well enough. The constant low hum of the life support systems becomes more audible when the foot traffic thins. The air smells different. The automated cleaning systems run a gentle cycle at 2000, and there's a faint mineral quality to the air for an hour after, like something clean and slightly cold. Corridor 7 was empty. I walked to Bay 7 and looked through the observation window. The room was quiet. The environmental controls were set to nighttime parameters, slightly warmer, which humans prefer during sleep, with the light source at 10%, the lowest setting that still allows for visual monitoring. The room looked calm. Corporal Rook was not asleep. He was sitting up in the bed. His tablet was on his lap, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at the window, not the observation window, the external one, which on this part of the station looked out onto the navigation corridor. A long, transparent tube through which you could see the exterior of the station, and beyond it, at certain angles, the scatter of stars in this sector. He was just looking at them. I watched him for a while. This is something I don't normally do. There's something uncomfortable about observing a patient who doesn't know they're being watched, and I prefer to keep my clinical contact direct and transparent. But I stayed at that window for what was probably 3 full minutes, watching this human look out at the stars with an expression that was quiet. That's the only word I have for it. Quiet in the way that things are quiet when they've found a temporary stillness inside something much larger. Then he turned his head, without any particular urgency, and looked directly at the observation window. I don't know how he knew I was there. The observation glass is heavily tinted from inside. A patient cannot see through it from their bed at any normal angle. But he looked at exactly the right spot, at the right height, with the particular steadiness of someone who isn't guessing. He raised one hand barely, in a small greeting motion. I pushed the intercom without really deciding to. "You shouldn't be awake," I said. "Sleep is essential to tissue repair." "I know," he said. His voice was calm. The intercom system has a slight reverb when used at low volume, and his voice through it sounded slightly warmer than it did in person, a quality of the speaker calibration we've never quite resolved. "I'll sleep. I was just looking." "At the stars?" "Yeah," a pause. "They look different from this part of the sector. The angle's different from what I'm used to." "Where are you usually based?" He thought about it. "Outer Arm. Coalition Forward Station Kellen 8. It's in a cluster dense with light. You can barely see individual stars from there most times, just this smear of light, almost like fog but brighter." He looked back toward the window. "From here you can see them separately, each one." I didn't respond immediately. "Does it bother you," he asked, "being this far out from home?" I was caught off guard by the question. Not because it was inappropriate, it wasn't, but because I had been the one observing him and the shift of direction was unexpected. "I grew up 2 systems from here," I said before I'd fully decided to answer. "Verath Prime. I've been on this station for 11 years. It stopped feeling far a long time ago." "Does it feel like home?" Another pause. "Some days," I said. He nodded, looking back at the stars. "That's honest," he said. "I appreciate that." I stood at the intercom panel for a moment longer than I needed to. "Corporal Rook, get some sleep." "Yes, Doctor." I walked back down Corridor 7 and out of the ward, and did not let myself think too hard about what had just happened until I was on the transit pod going home, in the humming silence of it, with the station lights blurring past the windows. And even then, I mostly just looked at them. Part 3, what the records showed. Section 6, I pulled his file. Day 10. I want to be clear that I had a clinical justification for reviewing Corporal Rook's full intake file. His healing rate was, as Tavris had noted, running ahead of projections. A human sustaining his type of injury should show early tissue consolidation around day 6 and more complete structural repair by day 12 to 14. His scan from that morning showed consolidation that looked more like day 14. He was healing ahead of schedule. That warranted a full record review. I told myself that. I sat in my office with the file on my screen and read through it from the beginning. The medical intake documentation was standard. Coalition Forward Medical Corps ID, age, species, primary unit Terran Combat Engineering Corps, which I had not previously noted. Not a combat infantry soldier, an engineer. The distinction matters because engineers in the coalition forces have a specific operational profile. They go where the damage is, not always when the fighting has stopped. His injury history, listed chronologically. Year 4463. Lacerations and minor bone fracture left forearm, sustained during collapse of temporary field shelter. Treated and released. Year 4465. Burns to the dorsal surface of both hands, partial thickness, from thermal exposure during power relay emergency. Treated and released. Year 4467. Concussive injury, mild traumatic brain event from pressure wave exposure during, the file notation said structural detonation, controlled, which I read as, something he was supposed to blow up, he blew up, but he was closer than ideal when it happened. Treated and released. Year 4469. Penetrating wound, right shoulder, foreign debris, sustained during emergency extraction from a compromised structure. Treated aboard Coalition medical vessel, released to duty after 8 weeks. Year 4471, third cycle, current admission. Blunt trauma left torso, microfracture rib structure, debris impact during maintenance walkthrough. I looked at the list for a while. 11 years of service. 11 years of going into places that were compromised or burning or about to come apart, of being the person whose job it was to understand the structure well enough to know where to cut and what to hold, and what would collapse if you touched it wrong. His service commendations were at the back of the file, in a coalition-formatted addendum that our intake system had pulled automatically. I'm not going to list all of them because that would take a while, but I will tell you that one of them was for an action in year 4468, during which Corporal Rook, then still Specialist Rook, had re-entered a station section that had been declared structurally unsafe and was showing secondary failure indicators, to seal a coolant line that would have, if unsealed, caused a cascade failure affecting the inhabited sectors. The citation noted that he had done this alone because no one else could be ordered to accompany him, and that the section showed full structural collapse 40 minutes after he exited. He was 21 when that happened. I closed the file and sat in my office for a while, looking at the wall. Then I picked up my datapad and walked back to the ward. Section 7, the question that started everything. I went to Bay 7 on day 10, not during rounds, not with a clinical pretext. I just went. I keyed the door open, stepped inside, and pulled the chair that was usually positioned at the foot of the bed and moved it to the side, what humans call beside, and sat down. He watched me do this with an expression that was more curious than surprised. I looked at him, he looked at me. Neither of us said anything for a moment that stretched out in a comfortable way, which was itself unusual, because silences between physician and patient usually have a texture to them. Anticipation, anxiety, the particular weight of waiting for clinical information that may or may not be good. This one was just a moment. I reviewed your full file today, I said. Okay. You've been injured a significant number of times. He nodded once, neither defending it nor making it into something it wasn't. You went back into a structurally compromised section alone, I said, in 4468. A pause. Yeah, he said. I stopped, searching for the right word. In clinical terms, that's a significant risk behavior. In most species, repeated exposure to injury situations creates avoidance conditioning. The opposite appears to be true for you. He considered this. There was something in his face that I was learning to recognize, a quality of consideration, of taking the question seriously enough to actually think before answering, which was less common in conversations than most people assumed. I'm not sure it's the opposite, he said after a moment. It's not that I don't avoid danger. I understand danger pretty well. It's more, he paused. It's more that when I understood what would happen if I didn't go back in, the math changed. 43 people in the inhabited sector, one structurally compromised section. A coolant line I knew I could seal if I moved fast and didn't second-guess it. He looked at his hands. The math changed, that's all. You calculate it. Doesn't everyone? No, I said honestly. Most species calculate the risk to themselves. The risk to others is a secondary consideration for most biological entities. Survival instinct is primary. He thought about that. Huh, he said, then maybe that's why he stopped. Why humans are what? He looked at me. Why we keep ending up in places like this, he said. Far from home, in a medical bay, healing faster than your charts say we should. Something about the way he said it, not bragging, not performing, just stating it the way you'd state a direction or a weather condition, made me feel something that took me a moment to identify. It was something like wonder, that particular sensation that occurs when you look at a thing you thought you understood and realize the category was wrong. Corporal Rook, I said. Davin, he said, if that's okay. Davin, I paused. Why do you talk to the nursing staff the way you do? He didn't look away. Because they work hard, he said simply. Because they're away from their families and their home systems, and they deal with sick and hurt people all day, every day, and nobody, not the patients, not always even the administration, actually sees that. He shrugged, a small motion that I could see pulled at his healing ribs slightly. I see it, so I say something. You've always done this. Since I was old enough to notice that some people in a room are invisible unless they need to be used, he said. I don't like that. I never liked that. Section 8, what Tavris finally said. Day 10, late afternoon. I found Tavris in the records room, which is where he goes when he wants quiet to think, and I sat across from him and asked him directly. Tell me what you know. He looked up from his own work, looked at me for a long moment. Then he set the datapad down. I was going to tell you, he said. When I understood it myself, he said, which was the most honest thing Tavris had said to me in 11 years of working together. It started on day 2, before Orvath, before any of the others. I was the one doing his intake review, you were with the Vreth patient, and I took the initial file review. And And I introduced myself and told him the clinical plan, and he listened carefully, and then he looked at me and said, 20 years on this ward, that's significant. That's a lot of lives you've held responsibility for. How do you keep it from weighing too much? Tavris paused. He read my service notation from the intake form, he said. It says years of service and nothing else, and from that one number he inferred correctly that I had been doing this long enough that it accumulates, and he asked about it, directly, with no hesitation. He looked at his hands. No patient has ever asked me that in 20 years, Dr. Carroll, not once, and I told him. I sat on the edge of the supply shelf and I told him that I go back to the stars when it gets too heavy. That I stand at the external observation windows after the last round, and I look at them. That there's something about that much distance that makes the individual weight of things feel more proportional. A silence. And he said, that's a good system. That sounds like something that works. Tavris shook his head slowly, not dismissively. Not performing interest. He was genuinely satisfied that I had found something that helped, like he'd been concerned about the answer and the concern resolved when he heard it. He picked up his pad again. I told Myron, he said quietly, not to send her in there. I told her that he was different, and I should have kept it to myself, but I wanted someone else to understand it, what I'd experienced in that room. He looked at me over the top of the pad. Why is he like that? He asked. The humans I've encountered before were like the file says, tough, efficient, high pain tolerance, faster healing, the usual. But I've never encountered one who was like this. I looked at him. I don't think it's rare, I said slowly. I think it's us. I think they're all like this, and we don't stay in the room long enough to find out. Part 4, The Truth in Bay 7. Section 9, the day I stopped making it clinical. Day 11. This is the day the council documentation focuses on, and I understand why, because it is the day the situation became visible in a way that could not be administratively tidied. But for me, the pivot had already happened the night before, at 2200, standing at the intercom panel talking to a human who was looking at stars. On day 11, I came to Bay 7 before rounds, before the shift technically began. I came with 2 cups of the warm liquid that humans call coffee. We keep a small supply in the nutrition bay specifically for human patients, because their attachment to it is well documented, and deprivation of it apparently creates what they describe as a physical discomfort. And I sat in the chair beside his bed and handed him one. He looked at it, then at me. Decaf or... I don't know, I said. I asked the nutrition bay to give me whatever the human patient standard provision is. They gave me this. He wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at it with an expression that was, I want to say warm, but it's more than that. Nostalgic. The way you look at something that is a small piece of a place you come from. That's very kind, he said quietly. I'm a physician. Nutrition is clinical. He looked at me over the rim of the cup. Right, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. We sat in a silence that was, again, comfortable. I have since thought a great deal about why silences with him felt comfortable when silences in clinical contexts almost never do. I think it's because he didn't fill silences with noise in order to manage them. He let them be what they were. He seemed to believe, or perhaps to simply know from experience, that quiet didn't need to be fixed. Davin, I said. Dr. Carroll. Iveth, I said, surprising myself. He considered this, Iveth. I want to ask you something that is not clinical. Okay. Why does it matter to you? I said. The people here, the nurses, Tavris. Why does it matter to you specifically whether they're seen? You're healing. You'll leave in a few days. You'll never see any of us again. Most patients treat the ward as infrastructure, something that exists to serve a function. They leave and they don't look back. He held his coffee cup and looked at the window for a moment. Then he said something that I have written down exactly as best I can reconstruct it, because I want to preserve the specific shape of it. He said, my father worked maintenance on a coalition cargo platform for 31 years. Not the glamorous side of the coalition, not ships, not stations, not anything with a view. The internal structure. The parts that keep everything running that nobody looks at until they break. He used to say that there are 2 kinds of people in any system, the ones who think they're important and the ones who make sure the system doesn't fail. And the second kind almost never know they're the ones holding it together. So you either go through your life feeling invisible or someone looks you in the eye and says, I see what you do, I see what it costs, and I think it matters. He looked at me. He worked 31 years in the structure of a cargo platform, he said. I can count on one hand the number of times anyone said that to him. The room was very quiet. So, he said, so I say it when I see it, I say something. He shrugged that same small, careful motion. It costs nothing to say it. And it turns out the value is, he looked around the room, at the medical bay that had become populated by nurses with no clinical reason to be there. It turns out the value is harder to measure than I expected. I sat with that. Outside the bay, in Corridor 7, I could hear the first sounds of the shift beginning. Footsteps, a cart moving, the soft alarm of a monitoring station acknowledging a routine vital sign, the ordinary machinery of a medical facility at the start of another day. Iveth, he said. Yes. How long have you been a doctor? I looked at him. 11 years here, 3 at a teaching facility before this. Do you like it? I opened my mouth to say yes, the automatic answer, the answer that doesn't require any specific thought, and then I stopped. Because he was asking in the same way he asked everything. Genuinely, directly, with the quiet readiness of someone who would actually receive whatever you gave him. Some days, I said, some days I think I can't imagine doing anything else, and other days I paused. Other days it feels very heavy and very far from where I started. He nodded slowly. That sounds honest, he said. You said that before. I meant it both times, he said. Honest is, it's rarer than it should be. Especially from people who are supposed to have the answers. Section 10, The Gathering. I need to explain what happened at 1400 on day 11, because it is the part of this account that became, according to the Council's language, a notable departure from standard ward protocol, and I want the record to reflect what actually occurred. At approximately 1330, Corporal Rook's scans came back from the diagnostic center showing complete structural consolidation of the injured rib structure. Full healing, ahead of the projected timeline by 2.5 days. Clinically, there was nothing keeping him in Bay 7. His discharge could be processed that afternoon. I reviewed the scans in my office. I confirmed with the diagnostic system. I sat with the result for a longer time than a straightforward discharge should require. Then I walked out to the nursing station and told Tavris. He looked at the scans I held out to him, looked at them for a moment. Full consolidation, he said. Yes. He handed the scans back. I'll prepare the discharge documentation. Yes, I said, do that. He went to the station terminal and began pulling up the templates. I watched him work. There was something in the set of his shoulders that I recognized as a particular kind of quietness. The quietness you carry when something is ending and you haven't quite decided how you feel about that. Tavris, I said. He kept typing. Doctor, when is his discharge processed? Does it go to the Coalition Transit office directly, or does the patient have a window to arrange their own coordination? Tavris paused typing, turned to look at me. Standard is a 6-hour coordination window, he said. After the discharge forms are signed, so if I process them now. Process them at 1600, I said. That gives him a discharge window of 2200. Tavris looked at me for exactly 2 seconds. Of course, he said, and turned back to the terminal. I went to the communications desk and did something that I have never done before and will likely never do again. I sent an internal message to the nursing staff, not the official channel, the informal one that read, Bay 7 patient discharge window opening at 2200. Staff who may be interested in saying farewell during this shift should plan accordingly. This is not a formal ward event. It is simply information. I sent it and immediately felt the mild professional anxiety of someone who has just done something that is technically within their authority, but is not at all within their habit. Then I went to Bay 7. Section 11, what I said to him. He was sitting up when I came in, looking at the scan image on his tablet. He'd been copied on the results, standard protocol. He looked up when I entered. So, he said, complete consolidation. You've healed well ahead of schedule. You look almost annoyed about that. I am a physician. I don't get annoyed when patients heal. I paused. I'm noting it as clinically unusual. Humans are clinically unusual, he said, with a quality in his voice that was not boasting. More like stating a fact he found genuinely interesting. Yes, I agreed. You are. He put the tablet down. When do I leave? Your coordination window opens at 2200. Coalition Transit will have a departure scheduled by morning. He nodded slowly. He looked around the bay, not with any particular emotion I could name, just the way a person looks at a room they've spent time in before they stop being in it. I'm sorry, I said. He looked back at me, slightly surprised. For the awkward first week, I said. The intercom, sending people out when they had no reason to leave. You were doing your job, he said. I was, I agreed. But perhaps I was also not doing something else, which is, I stopped. Let the sentence find its end slowly. Which is noticing what was actually happening, not as a management problem, as a phenomenon. He looked at me. You know what was happening, he said. Yes, I said. People who spend their professional lives not being asked how they are were being asked how they are, and they didn't know what to do with it, so they kept coming back to see if it was real. A long silence. It's real, he said quietly. I know, I said. I know that now. Section 12, the evening before he left. What the council documentation describes as a gathering of ward personnel in Bay 7, non-clinical in nature, approximately 15 to 18 individuals. Duration approximately 90 minutes. Began at approximately 1800 and ended when I finally, gently, firmly, requested that everyone go home and let the patient get some rest before his transport. I will not name all of them here. I'll say that Orvath was among the first, and Myron came about 20 minutes in, and Tavris, who does not as a rule participate in anything that could be described as a social gathering in the ward, came at 1900 and sat in the corner and said almost nothing, but also did not leave for the entire 90 minutes. I'll say that a Thalori nurse named Veth brought one of the small gratitude tokens their species gives when something has been meaningful, a folded piece of luminescent paper in a shape that means, roughly, an anchor against drifting, and placed it on his bedside table without explanation. And that he looked at it and said thank you in a way that I believe satisfied Veth deeply, because Thalori can tell when a thank you is felt versus performed, and she settled into quiet comfort for the rest of the visit. I'll say that Keed, the young Vexeni who had been the most embarrassingly obvious about appearing in Bay 7 without reason, sat cross-legged on the floor beside the bed because there weren't enough chairs, and seemed to find nothing strange about this, and that at some point, he and Rook were talking about something to do with structural engineering and Keed's interest in architecture, and I watched them go back and forth with the energy of people who have found an unexpected overlap, and I thought, something patients never feel with staff, that Keed was going to remember this for a long time. I'll say that at some point during the 90 minutes, Corporal Davin Rook looked around the room, at all of these people from all of these species, Verathari and Vexeni and Thalori, and 2 Vreth nurses who had wandered in from the adjacent corridor, and whose patients were stable enough to manage, and who had clearly heard something was happening. And the expression on his face was the same expression I'd seen when he was looking at the stars from the window. Quiet, settled, like someone who had found, in a strange place far from home, something that confirmed whatever it was he believed about the world and the people in it. Part 5 after. Section 13, the morning after he left. He was gone by 600. Coalition Transit runs early. I knew this and had still half expected to arrive at the ward and find him still in Bay 7 when I came in at 700, which is not rational but is also, I think, human in a very specific way. The way you know something is true and still feel the surprise of it being true. The bay was clean, environmental controls reset to neutral, bed at standard settings. The luminescent paper from Veth was on the bedside table. He'd left it. I picked it up and held it for a moment. The luminescence was warm and gold, shifting slightly as I turned it. The shape was unmistakable even for someone who wasn't Thalori, an anchor, a thing that prevents drift. He'd left it in the room as if he wanted it to stay in the room, as if the room should have it more than he needed to carry it. I stood there in Bay 7 for a while. Then I set the paper carefully in the corner of the windowsill, the external window, the one that looked out toward the navigation corridor and the stars beyond, and I went to begin my rounds. Section 14, what changed? This is the part of the account that the council found most pertinent, and I'll address it directly because I think directness is what the situation warrants. Things changed after that. Not dramatically, not in ways that would show up in a standard audit or a performance review, but in the texture of the ward, in the quality of its daily operation. Tavris started asking the nursing staff how they were at the beginning of each shift. Not the clinical version, "Are you prepared for today? Do you have any scheduling conflicts?" but the actual version. "How are you doing?" Not as a formality, just as a question. And he waited for the answer. I watched him do it for the first time on day 12, the day after Rook left, and I recognized exactly where it had come from because I had seen it in Bay 7, and the shape was the same. Orvath started pausing in patient bays a minute or two longer than strictly required. Not because she'd become inefficient, she remained precise, attentive, meticulous. But she'd linger at the end of a check and ask the patient one genuine question about their experience. Not their pain level, something about their experience. I watched her do it with the Vreth patient in Bay 12 and see the Vreth, a species not known for emotional transparency, shift visibly toward her. Just slightly, but unmistakably. I started sitting down more. That's the simplest way to say it. I had a habit of standing during patient conversations. Efficient, clinical, keeps the interaction focused. I started sitting down, pulling the chair to the side of the bed and sitting in it, taking an extra few minutes. And I want to be precise about what happened when I did this because I think precision matters here. The patients were better. Not medically better or not solely, their healing metrics didn't suddenly leap forward because I sat down. But the quality of the interaction was different, something relaxed. And when things relax, when the clinical tension of a medical interaction is reduced to its necessary minimum, bodies respond. In every species I have ever worked with, the relationship between psychological ease and biological recovery is undeniable and consistently underweighted in our standard practice. This is what the council asked me to document. This is the change I am documenting. It didn't come from a protocol update or an administrative directive or a training program. It came from a human engineer in a recovery bay in the outer ward who talked to people like they were worth talking to. Section 15, the message. He sent a message. 11 days after he left, Standard Coalition comms lagged from the outer arm to this sector. It came through the General Ward Communication Channel, addressed to Dr. Carroll. Tavris forwarded it to me without comment. I'm going to paraphrase it rather than reproduce it exactly, because it's a private communication, and I think that matters. He said he'd made it back to Kellan 8 without incident, that his ribs were fully functional, and his unit was already putting that to use, which he said with a tone I read as affectionate about his unit rather than complaining about them. He said the stars looked different from Kellan 8 back to the smear, back to the fog of light in the cluster. But he said that he looked at them differently now. That having seen them separated, distinct, each one visible on its own, he found he could imagine the separation even when looking at the blur. That had helped. He said, "Please tell Tavris I hope the wait stays manageable, and tell Orvath that the thing with the review board, I hope it resolved. And the others, I don't know all their names, but they know who they are." And then at the end, the last line of the message, he said, "You're good at what you do. I hope someone tells you that with some regularity. If not, consider this a start." Part 6, the record. Section 16, what I put in the final report. The Medical Ethics Council requested this account as part of their ongoing review of cross-species patient care standards, specifically in the context of non-Terran facilities treating human patients. The review was triggered by a statistical anomaly in Verath 9 ward data for the third cycle of year 4471. A significant and measurable improvement in staff-reported satisfaction metrics, and a corresponding improvement in patient outcomes across multiple species during that cycle. The council wanted to know why. I wrote them this account because I believe it answers the question more completely than any number of statistics. A human came to our ward. He was injured not critically, not dramatically. He healed, he left. And while he was here, he did something that none of us had a word for at the time. He saw us, all of us. The physicians and the nurses and the technicians and the people who refill the water canisters and calibrate the humidity controls and push the carts through the corridors at night. He saw us the way we try to see patients, as specific individuals, with specific histories, with the weight of specific accumulated days, and he asked about it. He didn't do it for any purpose I can identify. He didn't do it to receive anything in return. He didn't do it because it was required or because it served some function in a larger plan. He did it because he noticed that people were there, and he thought people were worth noticing. This is my report to the Council. I'm not certain what policy recommendation follows from it. I'm not certain that something like this can be turned into a protocol or a training module or a guideline. You can tell people to ask how their colleagues are doing, but you cannot tell them to mean it, and without the meaning it is nothing. It is exactly what we do now, which is, ask the question and move on before the answer arrives. What I can tell the Council is that the change I observed in this ward, in these specific people, was real. It was measurable, and it came from the simplest possible source. A person who knew that the question mattered and asked it anyway.